Good afternoon, everybody. It's just a wonderful crowd. Welcome to the 2017 Hans Fischer Lectureship. I'm Josh Miller, in case you don't know, Professor and Chair of the Department of Nutritional Sciences. This marks the 12th installment of the lectureship and the second to be held here in the New Jersey Institute for Food, Nutrition, and Health. It also represents the culmination of our year-long celebration of the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Rutgers Department of Nutrition, now called Nutritional Sciences, of which Dr. Fischer was the founding chair. The lectureship was initiated to honor Dr. Fischer's many contributions to Rutgers, not to mention his stellar and renowned contributions to the field of nutrition. And it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce to you Dr. Fischer.
Thank you very much. As all of you know, since last year, since the lecture was given last year, we have lived through a very chaotic period of time. Politically, in terms of foreign policy, economically, trade, you name it. But last and not least, also unfortunately in science. And the science of nutrition, again, unfortunately, has also had its share of problems. And instead of scholars and scientists making pronouncements which may be found to be subject to improvement and to change, the media, journalists, started to take over nutrition. And just in the last couple of years, there have been some best-selling books. Is fat killing us, or is sugar? One of the questions. Another question was, butter is back. And journalists like Gary Taubes, Sylvia Tara, as I said, have written bestsellers, and they are the latest gurus that seem to direct the traffic when it comes to nutrition. Very fortunately, we have the opportunity today to have Dr. Lichtenstein speak to us and help direct us towards the correct path once again. I also would like to thank my former colleague, Malcolm Watford, who sent out an email giving the specifics of a wonderful article that appeared in the New Yorker on April the 3rd, written by Jerome Groopman. Dr. Groopman is a senior scientist at Beth Israel Deaconess Hospital in Boston. And this is a marvelous article that I can highly recommend to you because it also talks about what I had just indicated, some of the important information that people like Tara and Taubes leave out when they try to make their case. But much more importantly, as I said before, is Dr. Lichtenstein, who is here and who has worked in this field for a long time and who is an expert in much of this important information by which we should continue to be guided. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the Executive Dean of the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences, Robert Goodman.
Thank you, Josh. Welcome, Ruth and Hans. And to all of you, this is an incredible, well, it's not incredible, it's entirely believable turnout for this event. And it upholds what the pattern here at Rutgers is. There are students, there are staff, there are community members, there are faculty, there are retirees. Everybody in the room is part of this community, and that's really important. So Peter Gillies, the founding director of the Institute of Food, Nutrition, and Health, and I hosted on Tuesday the latest semi-annual meeting of the Leadership Advisory Board of the Institute in the boardroom upstairs. And it got me thinking, so this Leadership Advisory Board is constructed of chancellors and vice presidents and deans. And it's one crystal testimony to the incredible breadth of this institute and of what nutrition at Rutgers has become over the past decades. It is a Rutgers-wide force. It is embarked on becoming a statewide force, and it will become a national and international force in the field of nutrition. Just one little example that I was mentioning to Alice is the investment that we've been making over the last few years with very senior hires and also with junior hires in the area of the microbiome, which is emerging into our science in a very powerful way. So far, happily, most of what is out there in the public domain is actually from science. But Hans is right. People will catch up because this is a big deal that will attract a lot of other kinds of attention as well. But the point that I want to make simply is that we are on the cusp of important frontier areas here, and a recent visitor wrote back to us after she went home to say what a powerhouse of the microbiome Rutgers was becoming. The other thing I want to say by way of introduction is to reflect on the arc of history. The power of the past. Because there's one individual, if you point back to where this all began, there's one individual to whom we can attribute the earliest steps in leadership that made today happen, and that's Hans Fischer. The power of the past in setting an institution on its early course, that 2 generations later has led to the blossoming of nutrition right at the center of the university of today, with all of the power that has been built and has been assembled by accretion and other activities to bring together one of the leading public research universities spanning the biomedical sciences and the basic sciences and engineering and pharmacy and the arts and humanities. This is truly a very different institution from the one that Hans joined many, many years ago. And I just want us all, particularly those of us who were young, oh, nobody laughed. That's interesting. Those of us who are young, everyone, right? It wasn't a joke. That's good. That leadership matters, and that individuals can make a difference. And Hans is an absolutely guiding light, and actually, as you can probably hear, a bit of an emotional case in my experience and in my view. So Hans and Ruth, welcome back. Welcome to all of you. And Alice, we're so delighted that you're here.
Thank you, Bob. All right. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Alice Lichtenstein as this year's Fisher Lecturer. Dr. Lichtenstein, Stein or Steen? I would get it back. Steen, okay. Thank you. Dr. Lichtenstein is the Stanley N. Gershoff Professor of Nutrition Science and Policy at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy, and Director of the Cardiovascular Nutrition Laboratory and Senior Scientist at the Jean Mayer USDA Human Nutrition Research Center on Aging at Tufts University. I want to pause right now to mention that both I and our former chair of our department, Dan Hoffman, are graduates of the Friedman School, and we mourn the recent passing of Stanley Gershoff at the age of 92. Dr. Gershoff was the founding dean of the Friedman School, and I think it is apt that we have Dr. Lichtenstein here, who holds the Gershoff Professorship, to speak to us today. Dr. Lichtenstein's research focuses on the interplay between diet and heart disease risk factors and addresses issues related to trans fatty acids, soy protein, and isoflavones, sterol and stanol esters, and novel vegetable oils in humans. She currently serves as the associate editor of the Journal of Lipid Research and the executive editor of the Tufts New Health and Nutrition Letter. She served on the 2000 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee and was vice chair of the 2015 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee and vice chair of the 2013 American Heart Association American College of Cardiology Guidelines Committee on the Treatment of Blood Cholesterol to Reduce Atherosclerotic Cardiovascular Risk in Adults. That's a mouthful. She has been much honored for her research and service, having received the 2006 Robert H. Herman Memorial Award in Clinical Nutrition from the American Society for Nutrition, ASN, the 2008 Women's Mentoring Award from the American Heart Association, the 2010 Excellence in Dietary Guidance Award from the American Public Health Association, and more recently, the prestigious ASN David Krzyzewski Career Achievement Award. Later this year, she will receive the Ralph Holman Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Oil Chemist Society. And last but not least, she is a member of the Food and Nutrition Board of the Institute of Medicine. So, without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Alice Lichtenstein.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone. And I have to say, this truly is an honor to be here. And I know that's sort of the way all the speakers start, that it's a true honor to be here, but it really is. And not only that, it's really very exciting because I spent the morning finding out even more than I could from the website. And I did go through the website quite carefully, and anything else I could find that, fortunately, Josh sent me about this center. And it's really quite extraordinary. I'm also a little bit intimidated because a lot of the challenges that I'm going to be highlighting, actually Rutgers is preemptively addressing. So I think you'll see a lot of synergy between what I talk about and what actually is going on, but this is truly quite an extraordinary place. I also was very fortunate to have breakfast with Dr. and Mrs. Fisher and actually find out that we live in the same town in Newton, Massachusetts, which I did not realize. But having read his biography, it is quite an extraordinary life that was summarized, at least I think up until 2009, and it didn't stop then. But one of the things I thought was most interesting is that we have certain parallelisms because Dr. Fisher ended up in Cuba for a year, and that was after, in a circuitous way of getting out of Eastern Europe. And my father also ended up in Cuba about 15 years prior to that, but he actually stayed until just before World War II, but it's an interesting parallelism. As far as disclosures, I have no disclosures. When you serve on federal guideline committees, you don't have the option for disclosures and or conflicts of interest. And I have been involved in a lot of federal guideline committees and feel that that's an important professional activity that one should serve on. So, no disclosures. As indicated, the topic I'm going to be speaking about is the intersection of nutrition science and policy. And I think this is really important because, as demonstrated here at Rutgers, that there's basic science and there's applied science. Then ultimately we have to translate this for the general public, and we want to be the ones to do it rather than some of these book authors, and I agree. I thought that New Yorker article was actually outstanding by Jerome Grossman. It really put things into context, particularly in contrast to a lot of the other book reviews that were written in other publications. So the way I want to address this topic is to discuss or pose three questions. The first is, do we know nutrition science? The second is, can we translate nutrition science into nutrition policy? And then what I'm going to be spending most of my time on is, can nutrition policy achieve change in the desired direction? And although it might appear that there's a simple answer to each of these, obviously it does get a lot more complex. So to start off with, do we know nutrition science? Well, we know a lot, and I'm primarily talking about nutrition science in the United States. There are other issues related to deficiency diseases, but focusing on nutrition policy in the U.S., we have virtually eliminated deficiency diseases. We've identified essential nutrients, so we think we certainly identified the major essential nutrients. If there are other phytochemicals that have yet to be shown to be essential, we're not sure, and we have to keep an open mind. But for the most part, we've identified essential nutrients. We've introduced successful fortification programs that have addressed some of the nutrition health challenges. So we've eliminated the goiter belt by adding iodine to salt. Vitamin D to milk has addressed issues related to rickets. And then with grain products, we add thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, and iron to refined grain products, and then more recently folate. And they've all been shown from a public health perspective to have had a significant impact. And we've instituted feeding programs and food assistance programs. Now, one can say that there's not enough money going into them, and the people that need them the most don't always benefit from them. And certainly with the recent events of this past year, there may be more concern about that, but that's a different topic, but at least we have some in place. However, we haven't always gotten it right, and unfortunately, not always getting it right has sometimes garnered more attention than all that we have gotten right. So what haven't we gotten right? Well, margarine versus butter, which has really allowed this thing, butter is back, to be emerged. That in the 1960s it became quite clear in humans, and it had been building up earlier in animal work, that saturated fat was associated with cardiovascular disease. Well, people wanted a substitute for saturated fat. And certainly butter, that actually started with Napoleon, who was trying to figure out a cheaper way to feed the troops, and then eventually it got adapted. So there was methods of hydrogenation of liquid vegetable oil. Liquid vegetable oil was considered to be a better option to butter. Unfortunately, it wasn't until the 90s we realized that the process of hydrogenation, which changed the physical characteristics of the liquid vegetable oil to a more solid butter form, which was advantageous in terms of food chemistry and product formulation, also formed trans fatty acids. So we had to reassess that, but it ended up sort of going in the direction that we hadn't anticipated as far as butter's back. And again, that's a whole topic unto itself. We went through a period where vitamin E, folate, beta-carotene, we thought just by popping a pill we would decrease risk of cardiovascular disease. And from the observational studies, that seemed to be relatively clear. In some cases, there was biological plausibility. Low folate levels result in high in homocysteine, and that was associated, at least in primates, with cardiovascular disease. Vitamin E, an antioxidant. If people are fed less vitamin E, you isolate their LDL, it's more susceptible to oxidation, and we knew that macrophages are more likely to take up modified LDL than unmodified LDL. But sure enough, as far as the intervention studies go, the randomized controlled trials, in all cases the results were null. And in the case of beta-carotene, also an antioxidant, in terms of cancer, it ended up having adverse effects in high-risk individuals, and was later determined that that had to do with a metabolic product of beta-carotene. So we learned they're not easy answers. Now, is it that the observational data were wrong? No, but people who routinely take these supplements may have other lifestyle characteristics and diet characteristics that resulted in a lower risk of heart disease and cancer. And then during the 90s, we had the low-fat craze. And initially we thought, well, low saturated fat is good. Well, if you lower total fat, well, maybe that's all that better. And what we found out was that that resulted in a dyslipidemia, lower HDL cholesterol levels, higher triglyceride levels due to carbohydrate-induced hypertriglyceridemia. There was a proliferation of fat-free brownies, cookies, crackers, ice cream, all those kinds of things. And ultimately, in 2000, we ended up modifying almost all the guidelines. So that would be NCEP, the National Cholesterol Education Program, the Dietary Guidelines, the 2000 Dietary Guidelines, the American Heart Association. But interestingly, as of last year, which was the most recent Gallup poll survey, it turns out when you ask people what are they most likely to avoid in their diet, twice as many say fat as opposed to carbs, and we had just gone through this low carb phase. So, we do have some explaining to do, and unfortunately sometimes where we don't get it right ends up garnering more press time than getting it right. But I think what's most important is that we have challenges, and we have to address the current challenges and not rest on our laurels. And one is that whereas we had emphasized chronic disease risk, and that's what we were focused on eliminating, we were focused on eliminating deficiency diseases. What our challenge now has to do with chronic disease risk, and we're making some progress, but we still have a lot more to go. And also nutrient overconsumption, that's an area that we had not spent a lot of time on, but now with the unregulated supplementation of lots of different foods with nutrients, we really don't have a good idea of how much people are consuming, in addition to which, because there are still the lingering recommendations in terms of nutrient supplementation, potentially vitamin E, folate, or beta-carotene as having positive effects, and then most recently vitamin D, where we're in a difficult situation where we assess nutrient adequacy on the basis of the RDAs, but there is some question about whether the RDA is the most appropriate, that a lot of people now are on vitamin D supplements, and what the general public sees, and I'm sort of neutral on this, it's not my area, but what the general public sees, and this was in last week's Science Times, was why are so many people popping vitamin D? And the question was, is it appropriate? Is there reason to suspect that there's a clinical outcome that is going to be cured or at least ameliorated by vitamin D supplementation? So this is what the general public's seen, and then we need, as a nutrition community, to sort of explain ourselves and put it into perspective. The other challenges, which I think really this is where Rutgers is focusing, has to do with big data. And that is now, with the newer methodologies, we have the capacity to generate tremendous amounts of data. You heard highlighting how Rutgers is expanding the program in the microbiome, and then we've got all the omics, lipidomics, metabolomics, proteomics. We're generating tremendous amounts of data that can give us tremendous amounts of insight into a lot of what we have done in the past. But we really need to figure out how to do it, because just having tremendous amount of data is not what we need. What we need is to be able to interpret that data and then put it into context. And it was very impressive. I spent a fair amount of time with Peter Gillies, and we were talking about just that's probably where our next challenge is, so it'll be interesting to see how things evolve here. However, this also is now in the public domain. So this came from last month, and it also was in the New York Times, being originally a New Yorker. That's the newspaper I tend to read. And this was exciting microbiome research, temper the giddy feeling in your gut. And but as many new breakthroughs and advances, the hype of the microbiome often outweighs the reality. This seems especially likely in the field of nutrition. Well, I'm not sure that's actually valid, that nutrition is more challenged than in other field, but this is what the public is reading, and it's something that we need always to be cognizant of. And as I said, I think Rutgers are actually poised to really make great contributions. But one of the other issues was, again, Dr. Fisher touched on, has to do with publication bias, and that Jerome Grobman addressed in his New Yorker piece, and he was really focused on book reviews. But I think this is something that the nutrition community also has to address, that we frequently rely on systematic reviews and meta-analyses. Certainly the 2015 Dietary Guidelines Committee, that was specifically proscribed, partially because of the resources that are necessary to do original reviews. And unfortunately, positive results tend to get more attention than negative results. And John Ioannidis has written a lot about this, and this is just one provocative article that he published, is Everything We Eat Associated with Cancer, a systematic cookbook review. And what they did is they, in a non-systematic way, selected 50 ingredients from random cookbooks. They then did searches and found about 80% of those ingredients had articles associated that were associated with cancer risk. And in many cases, there were single studies that were highlighted, and the effect size was essentially implausible. Yet it garnered a tremendous amount of attention. And I think that this is something, as scientists that adhere to the scientific method, we need to be careful about. But the other thing is that in terms of publication bias and then how useful systematic reviews and meta-analysis are, if we have a bias towards not publishing negative studies or holding them to a higher bar than positive studies because, well, maybe you didn't have adequate statistical power. If somebody else saw it, and we actually got this in a review of one of our articles, if somebody else showed an effect, you should have been able to show an effect also. We really then create a body of systematic reviews that may be inherently biased. And Nesson also addressed this actually this past year. Publication bias in favor of positive findings influences the distribution of published results. We find that unless sufficient fraction of negative results are published, false claims frequently can be canonized into fact. And this again seems to be what ends up being covered most in the popular press. And I suspect I'm not the only one who's run into this problem of having negative findings and then having a more difficult time publishing than positive findings. So the next question that I want to address has to do, can we translate nutrition science into nutrition policy? If this was a pop quiz for the graduate students, I suspect, or all the students, I suspect that the answer would be yes. And sure, we have lots of nutrition policy. We have the dietary reference intakes, which is the EARs, RDAs, AIs, AMDRs, and ULs. It was tough serving on that committee, getting them all straight, because each A stands for a different word. So that was tough ones, but we do have the dietary reference intakes. The problem now is they were generated in the late 1990s, and they haven't been updated, as opposed to the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, where there's a congressional mandate that they be reviewed and updated every 5 years. There's no such mandate for the DRIs, and I'll explain why that may be introducing some challenges. We have the nutrient facts label. We have nutrient health claims. We have the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. And we have MyPlate. So sure, we can translate nutrition science into nutrition policy. But one of the other things we have to recognize is that they're all interrelated. And if there's one weak link, then it's going to reverberate. So first, as I mentioned, the DRIs, dietary reference intakes, they're generated under the auspices of the Institute of Medicine. Currently, the challenge has been trying to find funding to update the DRIs. But it's actually very critical, because the DRIs have a major impact on the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, which are under the auspices of the Departments of Health and Human Services and USDA. And the reason is so important is the first task that the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee is given is to evaluate the state of nutrient status in the U.S. So they look at NHANES data, and then see which nutrients are over or under consumed. I think it started in 2005. Not only did they look at or assess and identify which nutrients are over or under consumed, but then went the next step, which nutrients are over or under consumed that will have a public health impact. Is there some kind of a clinical ramification? Because something like vitamin E, 80% of us underconsume it, but there's absolutely no clinical data to suggest there's an adverse effect. What that suggests is maybe the DRI or RDA, which is what's used to evaluate, may not be accurate. We had limited methodology at the time in the 1990s to actually determine nutrient requirements. It's not what one would consider sexy research that garners a lot of funding, but it has a major impact on the dietary guidelines. It also has a major impact on the nutrient facts label, which currently is being revised. Now that's under the auspices of the Food and Drug Administration, as is health claims, but we have DVs on all the nutrient facts labels, daily values, and they come from the RDAs. Up until the revised label, they were actually based on the 1968 RDAs, except if there were nutrients that for which there were not RDAs in 1968, then the most recent ones. Now with the new label, which is being phased in, those are going to be updated, but they're still dependent on the validity of the current DRIs. And then the federal food and nutrition programs, which affects millions of people in the United States, from the military to Meals on Wheels to all the federally funded feeding programs in our public schools, have to meet the criterion of both the DRIs and the dietary guidelines. And then lastly, we have MyPlate, and MyPlate is under the jurisdiction of the USDA, and it's supposed to be translating the dietary guidelines into food-based recommendations that then the public can assess using an interactive program. So yes, we can translate nutrition science into nutrition policy, but we have some concerns. So what I want to spend most of my time on is, can nutrition policy achieve the change in the desired direction? Because ultimately that's what we want. We just don't want nutrition policy so that we can say that we have it out there. And this is a busy slide, so I'm going to go through it slowly, but this is some of the more recent data on trends in the U.S. food intake. And the thing to do is, for each grouping here, is to look at the progression. So the darkest bar refers to the NHANES data from 1999 to 2002, then the light blue bar from 2002 to 2008, and then the last wave was 2009 to 2012. And on the y-axis is the percent of U.S. Population that actually meets the recommendation. And you can see, well, it sort of looks like the situation is improving for whole fruit and whole grains, but you're still talking about a very small fraction of the U.S. population that's actually meeting the guidelines. And there's a nice upward trend in refined grains, which means lower intake being replaced by whole grains, and nuts and seeds, but then you see a slippage, which means that more processed red meat is consumed. There is some gains in lowering the amount of added sugar, but then the seafood intake, and there's been a recommendation for a very long time on seafood, is not doing well, as is fiber, even though we're seeing the increase in whole grain intake. Potassium, a nutrient of concern, not much progress, and not much progress as far as saturated fat. So this is sort of one way of looking at the data. Another way of looking at the data is to put it all together. So this, again, is from the same database, and the red is a representation of those people, or percent of the individuals in NHANES who would be ranked as consuming a poor diet as far as adherence to guidelines, the yellow intermediate, and then if you can see the green up on the top, very small, that actually hit the mark. So the good news is about 10% of Americans have shifted from, this is 2003 to 2012, from out of the poor to the intermediate, but it's really quite small in terms of those who've actually meeting current guidelines. So we have a lot of nutrition policy. However, we still have a long way to go as far as translating that policy and getting people to actually adhere to it. So there have been some efforts to try to get people to change their diet, and I'm going to give you two examples. The first has to do with going into the schools and trying to get the staff and faculty to choose healthier diets. So this was a study where there were 3 experimental approaches. For the next study, it's 4 experimental approaches. And you probably, if I asked for a show of hands, you could guess which one was the most efficacious. So the first group, it was a discussion, decision, interactive. They presented the information about what healthier lunches would look like. Group 2, it more was lecture, so it was a passive audience. And then 3 was a control group. And sure enough, group 1 did the best. About half the people improved their choices. About 31% in group 2, and 10% they probably knew something was going on, so they improved also. And that's why it's always important to have a control group. Well, that data came from a publication from 1948. And we haven't moved that far. And what's really amazing is that study was done in Newton, Massachusetts. Who knew? Anyway, more recently, and this was published this year, this is the study that David Jenkins did up in Canada. And he had 4 interventions. So we're skipping over from 1948 to 2017. But there's a lot of very interesting literature in between. So it was done in Canada. So his control group, he handed them essentially a pamphlet on Canada's food guide, which is not all that different than the US. Group 2, they provided dietary guidance based on the DASH dietary pattern and the dietary portfolio principles, which was a study that David Jenkins ran, and it had to do with increasing fiber and soy and more of a plant-based diet. And they did this by providing counseling counseling to the person in the family who was responsible for procuring and preparing the food for the first month every week over the telephone, a 20 to 30 minute phone call, and then every month thereafter for 6 months. To the third group, they just provided the food. They gave, and everyone got the Canada's food guide, but they just provided the food. So they provided more fruits and vegetables and whole grains and all those things, and they got weekly deliveries of the food. And then the fourth group, as you might have guessed, got the dietary advice, and they got the weekly provisions. So how did we do as far as changing people's food intake? Well, with fruit, it was interesting that, again, the control group improved also, again, the importance of control groups, but giving the dietary counseling increased fruit intake. It wasn't statistically significant, and this was changed from baseline, but it was significant with the 2 groups that actually got the food delivered to them. With vegetables, surprisingly, giving them the vegetables had no difference in counseling them. Still not significantly different, but better than control group. But the counseling and the food had an effect. Go figure why it would be so different for fruits and vegetables. And then with whole grains, the pattern was more similar to the fruit, although it was significant for the group that got the advice. Okay, so that was the 6 months changes. Well, after 6 months, they then followed them for a year. And this is what happened. Fruit, no significant difference. Vegetables, no significant difference. With the whole grains, a funny pattern. It seemed that having given it to them and the advice had significant effect, but what went on with the advice group versus control group, that's why you do statistics. There wasn't a significant difference. But what about other factors? What about things like body weight, blood pressure? One other thing, retention. Retention is interesting because if you do human intervention studies, retention is one of the biggest challenges that you have. The worst thing you can do is have a subject drop out prematurely because it costs a lot of money and it can threaten your power. So it turns out with the two groups that got the food, their retention rate was 91% after the 6 months with the active, and then following them, it was 81%. So that's considered good for a human intervention trial. For those that didn't get the food, it was really lower, 61%, and then it went at 6 months, and it went down to 57% at the 18 months. But in terms of body weight, there were in all groups, there was a statistically significant decrease, modest. It looks big because of the scale, but we're talking about kilograms. But it was not statistically different among all the groups. And the same thing with waist circumference. Now, this is really active intervention. Now, what about biological outcomes? Systolic blood pressure, not a significant difference, but not a pattern you would have expected. Diastolic blood pressure, similarly. What about other biological outcomes that they measured? No significant effect on serum lipid and lipoprotein concentrations, blood glucose concentrations, or the estimated 10-year coronary heart disease risk estimate. So this is a challenge. This is very difficult, getting people to change even when you provide them with information or provide them with food. We have a challenge, and you guys back there, most of you are back there, but some of you are up front. This is what's going to be on you guys, because this is what the future is, and I would contend that this is where we have to spend more time. So I'm going to now propose a mini question, or a question within my primary question. And why is nutrition policy ineffectual in moving people in the desired direction? Because we really have had a lot of information for a long time, but we're still challenged on how to get people to change their diets. And I've sort of shortened the question to, why aren't people following our advice? We spend so much time, you spend so much time on committees formulating this advice. And you really wonder why you're doing it. And what I'd contend is that we have societal environmental factors and we have individual behavior. And actually, it's the interplay of both of those two. And what we have to do is learn more about that so that we can actually improve the nutritional quality of the diet and then hopefully have a positive effect on things like chronic disease risk while avoiding overconsumption. So it isn't all negative. And what I want to talk about is societal environmental factors that impede positive change, and those I term the challenges, and societal environmental factors that promote positive change, success. And fortunately, we do have some examples of that, and we should learn from those. So, challenges. We do have an expanding food supply. There's just more food out there. And if you look at the data from 1970 to 2010, the categories that have expanded the most are the added fat, and particularly the dairy fat, and then the refined carbohydrate. And the two categories that we have spent time from the inception of the dietary guidelines and even before that, the fruits and vegetables, have been rock solid. We have not been able to get people to increase the intake. So what's happened? If you increase some groups, you don't increase other groups, you're going to have increased body weight. What we also know, and these data are from the 1930s to 2010, is that as a proportion of food disposable income, we spend less on food than we've ever before. Now that's good because it means that those individuals with lower income can afford adequate amounts of food, so that is good. The problem is there's a disproportional cost for food. So this on the y-axis is a relative scale for the general cost of food. And what I really want you to focus on here is first the nutrients that are in these foods are represented by these foods that are below 100, the sort of normalized data. And you can see it's added sugar, trans fat, saturated fat. And the bottom line is these are the foods that are high in these nutrients are relatively cheap, while those that have the essential nutrients, the ones that we tend to want to promote people consuming, on a relative basis tend to be more expensive. given the percent of the disposable income that goes to food, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is going to be a major impediment. But if you want to get the most from your food dollar, you're not going to end up purchasing the foods that are most consistent with a healthy diet. And then we have the challenge, which we have to recognize, is the foods that are most heavily advertised and discounted tend to be those with the added sugar. So we probably all get these flyers every week, and look what's on sale. Chips, cookies, crackers, chips, pudding, sugar water, and then those that are high in salt. And I could probably highlight a couple of the other canned ones, salt. Those are the ones that are promoted. Those are the ones that are on the end aisle displays. And it's challenging because we as a nutritional community are telling people not to focus on those, focus on the others. Now, there are sales on other things also, but this is more the rule than the exception. One of the other challenges is the proportion of the money that we spend on food is shifted from that is consumed at home to that's consumed away from home, or at least prepared away from home. So that now it's about 50-50 for the average American. It doesn't translate that way to individuals, but a lot of people consume a lot of food that's not prepared away from home. And there's certain issues related to that in terms of portion size and what goes into it, and having control about the amount of sodium. But the one thing I will want to mention is that we do need to be a little bit circumscript here, that these data have to do with coronary heart disease mortality and frequency of Western fast food items. And you can see there's a linear relationship with the amount of fast food that people report eating, and in this graph it's coronary heart disease. But we've got to be a little bit careful about interpreting these data, because we know that there are a lot of factors that co-vary in diets and lifestyles. So just sort of a word of caution that people that eat in fast food restaurants, if you look at the first table of most of those publications, they tend to smoke more, exercise less, eat fewer fruits and vegetables, and all sorts of things. But it is part of a lifestyle, part of a diet, and that's one of the reasons why sometimes we do focus on food that's prepared outside the home. Another challenge that we have is just fad diets, that although sometimes fad diets will suggest that we can sidestep the first law of thermodynamics, which says that you can't create or destroy energy, the bottom line is we really can't. So you see ads like this, no dieting or pills, no meal or snack forbidden, can experience easier weight loss than ever before. And we know what the results of all these fad diets are. You've seen these things. Well, anyway, so first, the 1970s, it was a low-carb diet. 1990s, we had the low-fat diet. Then the low-carb diet reemerged in the 2000s, and of course now we've got the gluten-free diet in 2010. And what's happened as far as the trajectory as far as body weight in the U.S., and you've seen these, and the darker the colors, then introducing new colors, it's gotten worse and worse. And then in 2015, they actually had to add a new rubric in terms of colors because we increased so much. So fad diets are not helping us, and all those books that claim that they can tell you the magic approach to diet that's going to allow you to easily lose weight is just not working. And this has become particularly important, and this happened to come out last week in the New England Journal of Medicine, is that one of the reasons this is of so much concern and why I was so struck by the program, the preschool program downstairs, and potentially introducing nutrition education at that point, is this shows the trajectory of type 2 diabetes in a very young group. This is age 10 to 19, and particularly for minority groups, the rate of type 2 diabetes has increased tremendously, and we're just talking about 2004 to 2012. And this, from a perspective as they get older in terms of quality of life and healthcare expenditures, is going to have immense impact. So it is something that we need to take different approaches if we're going to try to get people to change their diets. Now, one of the knee-jerk things we say, we always want a simple answer. And one has to do with portion size, and that's why people who eat out more have a big problem. And certainly at one point that wasn't a problem. So this is just McDonald's fries. This is just one example, Wendy's fries. And if you look at the size in 1998 to 2002, at McDonald's, large size got reclassified as medium, the super size got reclassified as large, and then a super size was added. And there's always a monetary advantage because per ounce of fries, it gets cheaper the bigger the order you get, and you also get to have more sodium. With Wendy's fries, the small became a kid's meal, so how can an adult go in and add a kid's size, order kid's size? I'll just embarrass you. The medium got larger, and then there was no change in the biggie or the great biggie. Now, in 2006, after a very popular and damaging film, the McDonald's sort of retracted a bit, and the medium got slimmer. The large got slimmer, although it was still bigger than the large in 1998, and they dropped the super size. But the other chain that did not have all that public scrutiny, the medium got reclassified to small, the biggie got reclassified as medium, and of course it's embarrassing to go in and ask for a great biggie. It just got reclassified to large. So some people who may not even realized that if they ordered a medium, they were actually getting more, actually did. So the knee-jerk reaction is, well, this is the problem, if we could just reduce portion size. Well, a graduate student, Lorianne Urban and Sue Roberts and I at Tufts looked at this a little more carefully, and this is a very busy slide. This just is summarizing the data on small size meals, those bundle meals that are ordered, and then the large size meals. And we were not allowed to indicate which chains they were. There were 3 chains, green, red, and blue. And what you can see, looking from 1999 to 2013, and we use that time period because starting in 1999, the websites for the fast food restaurants and other websites were archived, so we had access to it. Really didn't change that much. They didn't change that much for the red, and they didn't change that much for the blue, maybe a small uptick. And the same thing with the large size. For the green, not much of a change. For the red, not much of a change, a little dip, and then it started recovering. And for the blue, a little bit of an uptick. But it was still just, and this is just to illustrate that we've got to be very careful about knee-jerk reactions and finding simple solutions. A simple solution to overconsumption and not consuming a dietary pattern, a healthy dietary pattern, is not going to be an easy one. There's not going to be one single factor. But as I said, I talked about a lot of the societal factors that impede putting into practice dietary policies that we feel will have a positive effect. We also have some societal environmental changes that actually promote positive success. Now, this is not one that I am advocating, but I am a visiting professor in Finland, so I'm there a lot, and I remember when McDonald's first came to Finland, and this is one of the things that happened. A fringe group captured Ronald McDonald, and there it was. Not advocating that, okay, guys? But I do have some things that I'm advocating, and it's very interesting that, again, Peter Gillies was mentioning that you were considering. And 2010, David Ludwood and I wrote a commentary for JAMA where we titled it Bring Back Home Ec Education. And then we talked about it not being the traditional home ec education. The first thing I will tell you is it's not called home ec anymore. It's family and consumer sciences. And there were a lot of people up in arms. But we learned. However, we weren't talking about that, but we do feel that it is important to start putting renewed emphasis on nutrition education in schools, and that can be preschool, and it's certainly age appropriate from K through 12. And there are a number of reasons for that. The first is it will lessen dependence on prepared food outside the home. But more importantly, when you think about the trajectory, we want healthier options to be available in the supermarkets and restaurants. Industry is happy to do that if it sells. It's not industry versus the consumer. If the consumer buys more of the healthier options and orders more of the healthier options, we're going to see more healthier options. If they don't, we're going to see less. If we can create generation and then generations that are ordering these healthier options and supporting buying these healthier products, we will likely see more of them. We also have a lot of nutrition information that's available. I talked about Nutrient Facts panel, but we have just a whole myriad of apps. We have websites. There's just a lot of information out there, but unless you know how to use it, you're not going to use it. So we need to teach the next generation how to use it, and then they're going to grow up and they're going to influence their children's eating behaviors. And it's really what you do, not what you say. You don't tell kids to eat a salad or eat vegetables. It's just if it's part of the diet, that's what's going to happen in most cases. So I think we've underestimated the importance of nutrition education early on, and hopefully that will happen eventually. We also have some examples of in sort of initiatives that have been introduced that have been very positive, and I think the first has to do with hydrogenated fat. So in 2006, the FDA mandated that trans fat had to be on the Nutrient Facts panel. Now, do we think that most people actually read those Nutrient Facts panel, or that little buried line, extra line, is going to do much? Probably not. However, there are secondary implications, and one has to do with the companies reformulating their products. So again, it's hard to see the individual data here. So what I'm going to highlight is the ones where the products where we see a precipitous drop in those that had trans fat after this was mandated. So donuts, not surprising, the donuts were fried in partially hydrogenated fat. Cookies, baked products made with partially hydrogenated fat, major source of trans fatty acids. Commercially fried foods. Who knew ice cream had hydrogenated fat in it? But that's where we saw drops. So it's sort of secondary. It means the default option is the healthier option, and I'm going to keep using that term, that it wasn't apparent that people really understood that a lot of the products they were purchasing were formulated. It may not be that a lot of these products are the ones we hope people would be choosing, but the bottom line is they were a better choice. New York City also banned the use of trans fat, and they really focused their efforts on educating the restaurateurs that were affected so that the transition could be made. They put companies on notice they couldn't start increasing the price of the alternatives to partially hydrogenated fat. They would be watching that, and that the chefs, that they shouldn't be substituting fat that was high in saturated fat, because then they would start regulating that also. And this is some early data before and after the ban was put into effect, that you essentially had an elimination of those products, and this was in New York City, that were high in trans fat, and you had a real increase in those that had zero trans fat. And that's this is an article that came out last week. I don't think it's in print yet, and it got a fair amount of press, and this was looking at data from counties that had a restriction on trans fat, that's partially hydrogenated fat, and those that didn't. And the lower ones had the restriction, and they were looking at myocardial infarct and stroke. And if you use your imagination, you can see that there's a bigger differential. It's really a little bit hard. The difference is small. Where they really saw a difference was with the rate of stroke. Now, we need to be careful also with those types of data and hyping those types of data too much, because there were other changes between 2002 and 2014, like a dramatic decrease in smoking, introduction of calorie labeling. So there were a lot of things that were going on also, but at least it's showing it didn't have a negative effect. And again, the default option was healthier for a lot of people. And then the last positive thing that happened with trans fat was in 2013, November, the FDA announced they were going to remove partially hydrogenated fat from the GRAS list, generally recognized as safe. It took almost 2 years, but this was formalized in June of 2015. So now, if you want to include partially hydrogenated fat in a food product, you need to have a special petition to the FDA. So that's something that's good. The default option is a better option. Some things are working, but maybe not working as well as we had hoped, and that doesn't mean it's not going to help in the future. The same time that a ban was imposed by New York City on the use of partially hydrogenated fat, mandatory calorie labeling was also introduced, so calories needed to be posted prominently on menu boards and printed menus, and what that meant is that the caloric content of the item needed to be in the same font size as the price. And that if there were daily specials, that they needed to be labeled also with total calories, and that the same thing for the value meal. So this is what it's seen. How many of you have actually seen calorie labeling? You're pretty close to New York, yeah, a fair number of you. So this is what it looks like. So this is the price, and this is the number of calories, because bundled meals sometimes and individual items can be customized. You see ranges. Here's another example of it where the calories and the price needs to be in the same font size. This I thought was just interesting, because for 89 cents you can get either 107 calories or 460 calories. That's a big difference. And for 99 cents, you can get either 200 calories or 420 calories. New York City tried to introduce some education, and how do you put that in perspective? Because what does 500 calories mean if you don't know that the average person needs about 200? So they came out with a series of this, and then with the tagline, if you eat this, what's left? The data are not encouraging on whether people used it. This was a comparison between New York City and Newark. People didn't seem to be using the data. Then the data were parsed out, those that didn't notice, those that noticed but decided they weren't going to use it, and those that noticed and thought they were purchasing lower items, and whether it be for the whole group, males or females, didn't seem to have much of an effect. Other approaches have been considered and tested, minimally successful. This was at calorie labeling plus the traffic light, green, red, or an orange and yellow in the middle. Limited success, so we need to do a little more on that. But again, as far as the default option, suddenly we saw the introduction of lower calorie options. And this is an example of a number of them. So again, more what's available as opposed to people actively using the information. If that's what it takes, that's what it takes. And then the last one I'm going to address is to do with sugar and added sugar. We hear a lot about it. We know that most of the added sugar, or a high proportion, comes from liquid beverages, and then also snacks and sweets. Fortunately, the trend is going down for sugar-sweetened beverages. Is still extremely high, but I think it's important. Sometimes in the nutrition community, we're hesitant to acknowledge when they're positive changes because they're not, quote, good enough, and we should acknowledge those. Why do we care? And these are data looking at individuals who increased their sugar-sweetened vegetable beverage or 100% fruit juice consumption. The caloric density is essentially the same, and they gained weight over a 4-year period. New York City was proactive in trying to demonstrate what the amount of sugar looks like. And I am going to use just a little bit of time to show you. This is a very quick clip from New York City. Okay, this is to say that we don't always have to keep recreating the wheel, that there's a lot of good stuff that's out there. We should take advantage of it. This I just thought was a particularly great one. There are other ones on how much you have to walk and run in order to to burn off candy bars. There's a lot of great stuff out there, and I think we should take advantage of it. This is freely available. And then there are other approaches. This has to do with the Mexico introducing a tax on sugar-sweetened beverages, and that the sales are falling. That may be one way. I think there's some confusion because Philadelphia introduced a tax, but it's on both sugar-sweetened beverages and diet beverages, so I think the public may be a little bit confused about that. They did it in order to fund education, but there are a lot of different ways of addressing it. The FDA has now mandated in the revised label that I had alluded to earlier, there is going to be a line for added sugar. I suspect what's going to happen is what happened with the line for trans, is that we're going to see a reformulation of a lot of products, and we'll see what the effect is. If it means that it's reformulated, but there's no decrease in calories, then and because the less sugar is put in but more refined carbohydrate in some products, that's not going to help. In other cases, it probably will help. So lastly, to conclude, looking forward, what approach should we take moving forward? And this is where I've got a question mark, and this is where I look to the students and the postdocs, because this is where I think we all need to be thinking about. We have made progress. I think we need to acknowledge our progress. We need to acknowledge where we've fallen short, and what we really have to do is focus on the future. So with that, we talked about, do we know the science? We talked about translating science into policy, and spent most of our time talking about how this all impacts on the public. And with that, I will show you the good, the bad, and the ugly. And thank you very much for your attention.
All right. Questions? Don't be shy.
Challenge me.
Tracy.
That was a really beautiful talk. So I have so many questions. I'm just going to pick my best one, I think.
But thank you.
Much of your talk was focused on what to restrict and of fat, different fat. But certainly there are certain fats that we're also told that we should eat more of. Okay, fish is one of those kinds of fats that we should eat. So I'm just wondering your thought. Now that we know that all the fish in the world is consuming plastic at a rate that we can't even comprehend, aside from the criticism about recommending fish because we would drain the world's oceans of fish if we all kept the recommendations, I'm hitting on sustainability here. Just how healthy is even fish now with knowing that we have all these plastic toxins that are building up in our oceans? And just your thoughts on where we place that.
Sure. Okay, well, first, as far as restricting fat, we don't want to restrict fat, and you're right. We want to talk about people using liquid vegetable oil and replacing sources of saturated fat, primarily animal fat, meat and dairy fat, with liquid vegetable oils, and not to be scared of liquid vegetable oils. One other source of fat is fish, and then there are things like seeds and nuts. As far as fish and contamination, the Dietary Guidelines, the 2015 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee spent an immense amount of time on that. And I think what you need to think about is the risk-benefit ratio. And right now, the benefit of eating fish, both for the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, but also if you're eating fish frequently, you're not eating quiche or steak or a hamburger or something like that, far outweighs the risk. Now, there are certain subgroups, pregnant women, very young children, where the dynamics are a little bit different. There's also higher contamination species, the larger fish that accumulate because they eat all the little fish, and the lower contamination fish. And that's updated on a regular basis on the FDA website. Now, as far as sustainability, we also looked into that a lot. There is a tremendous amount of fish farming. And the farm fish, their fatty acid profile is totally dependent on what they're fed. And right now, if you go on the USDA website, it's pretty much comparable between farm fish and wild-caught fish. The amount of contaminants in farm fish versus wild-caught fish is totally dependent on what water they grow up in. It really doesn't matter. The other issue with sustainability has to do with the environmental impact of fish farms, and that initially was not adequately addressed. Now there are major regulations on that. So I think the benefits of consuming fish far outweigh the potential risks. And right now, these are potential risks. But it's something that we have to keep monitoring. And we also, myself included, need to avoid talking about restricting fat. It's really substituting one kind of fat for another kind of fat and not one kind of fat for carbohydrate.
Before we take another question, can we follow up on the sustainability issue and how there was a lot of work done on that in the dietary guidelines, and then they disappeared from the dietary guidelines? So can you talk to the political nature of it?
Okay, all right. Well, there were some issues. As far as the recommendations on fish, those remained. As far as the issues related to sustainability, those were in the advisory committee report. They were not included in the dietary guidelines for Americans. And the advisory committee hands the report to the Secretaries of Health and Human Services and USDA, and then there's a congressional mandate that the committee dissolves. Then there's this black box period, and the government agencies develop the dietary guidelines, and then an hour before they were released and presented to the press, we were told the day before that there was going to be a release for us. So if you happened to be teaching that morning, you missed it. I actually I was not as offended that issues of sustainability were not put in the dietary guidelines themselves, because I think there was been too much of a sort of dilution to try to get more specific. If you look at the trajectory of the guidelines, and if anyone's going to be at experimental biology, I will be giving a talk on the dietary guidelines between 1980 and 2015 and actually chronicle that. They have become less clear. And one of the things our committee emphasizes, we needed to go back more to guidelines, what people should be doing. We started addressing sustainability. The committee was not configured to have expertise in sustainability and environmental issues. 2 people were added post hoc as advisors. And I think what was important is what we accomplished was putting it on the radar. And now it will go to the next committee or to an independent committee. And the reason I say an independent committee is the 2000 Guidelines Advisory Committee, which I also served on, was the first one to separate energy balance, achieving a healthy body weight, from physical activity, because they are different. There are benefits to physical activity independent of effects on body weight. And what that spawned eventually was guidelines. There is a committee working right now revising the physical activity guidelines. We should be looking at sustainability and environmental factors, but you need people that really are very cognizant of all those issues, and hopefully that will be a result of us putting it on the board. But I actually like simplifying the guidelines.
That was a wonderful talk. I have a
Thank you.
sort of comment that I'm going to try and phrase as a question. You talked a lot about fad diets, and you brought up this gluten-free diet, which is certainly a big thing. And I don't know how big a deal this is on the East Coast, but I've just moved here from Oregon, and certainly a fad diet that's out there is the non-GMO diet. And how much of a concern is it to you that labels such as made with non-GMO ingredients can mislead consumers into making unhealthy choices, like choosing a non-GMO margarine over a GMO margarine, or a non-GMO Snickers bar over a GMO Snickers bar? And I mean, is there something that we should be doing?
I think we should be doing something that I think there's a lot of, and this is just personal because this is not my area of research, but I think there are a lot of misunderstandings about GMOs. I think there are a lot of misunderstandings about locally sourced. Everybody wants locally sourced. Well, in the Northeast, if we just relied on locally sourced, a lot of us would be scorbutic by this time of year. And somebody wants locally sourced, but then, yeah, by the way, do you have a slice of lemon for my tea? And I think it's sort of the same idea that with GMO or selectively, first of all, I don't think people appreciate the difference between genetically modified and selectively bred. Yet, in reality, there's really not that much difference. There's certainly advantages in terms of drought resistance, of using less pesticides, of just these, again, knee-jerk reaction. Well, if it's GMO, it's got to be bad. And we saw that with the natural versus, or an organic versus regular. At one point I had a slide for peanut butter, and it was a national brand, and there was the, there was the organic, natural, and then there was the regular one. And it turned out the natural organic one had more sugar in it. Why do it? So I think that, again, that's a challenge that the nutrition community has. And perhaps if we tried to get in front of the issues as opposed to reacting afterwards, we might have a better chance. And we saw this with irradiation. Now, if you irradiate food, you can extend shelf life. It doesn't make the food radioactive. But essentially, I think it was in the 60s that was introduced, and then it had to be dropped because of the implications. And we didn't get ahead of it. And I think we're in that situation with the GMO right now. It is challenging and unfortunate.
Thanks, Alice. So I want to take us back to the very beginning of the hour, which Hans started off by reflecting on the public publishing industry as a place where we have problems. We also have opportunities, of course. Full disclosure, Dan Barber is a friend, but the Third Plate is, I think, an example of something that points us in the right direction. Mary Nestle's work, of course. What are your thoughts about the balance of what's published in the lay press, in the intelligent readers press, books and so forth? Because it's not all bad, right?
Well, it's certainly not all bad, but the bad tends to sell more. Yeah. And that's, again, a problem because books are driven, and the publishers are going to choose books that they think sells the most. And it seems the most extreme you are, the better you do. And it's the same way if you're debating someone or on a panel with someone. I was, and the first and the last time, because I learned to be more careful, but I was on a TV program with Barry Sears, The Zone Diet. And the moderator was asking us questions, and he said things that I thought were just scientifically unsupportable. And I, as a scientist, wasn't going to say things that I didn't think were absolutely valid. And as I showed with things that we got wrong, we always have to temper our comments on the basis of what may emerge with new data. But the books, the books that are more informative and are more scientifically based don't appear to sell more. So in addition to the one you mentioned, the Heart Association put out the No Diet book, trying to just to talk about healthy diets. That did really poorly. Mim Nelson, who was at my institution, had a series of books, Strong Women, Strong Bones, Strong Women, Healthy Women, all that. So we did Strong Women, Strong Hearts. That didn't do particularly well. So that is a challenge. And then the other question is, in this day and age, much are people reading books versus looking at websites? And there's really no good way to filter the quality of guidance on websites, and some of it is quite extraordinary. And I'm responsible for the nutritional biochemistry, applied nutritional biochemistry course at Tufts, and I spend a fair amount of time each week with people bringing in stuff they've seen either on the web or newspapers or magazines, and then having them source out where those information came from and the translation of it. And it's really, again, can cause the public to be very confused. Usually, whether it's the books or these reports, come up with a really simple answer. And we've learned time and time again that it doesn't stand when it's actually tested.
Nice lecture, thank you. So you alluded to this sugar problem, or maybe more than alluded to it. And you spoke about the sugar tax, you spoke about the calories, and you spoke about Mexico being successful, but Philly not being successful. Do you have any comments on what we should advocate as reducing sugar from beverages or other items?
That's a $64,000 question. I don't know. I mean, it's not that Philly is not successful. It's just they introduced it in a different way. They were trying to raise money for education, but so they included both diet and sugar-sweetened beverages. But because that got confounded with what's happening in Mexico and other places with a tax on sugar, and I think in California they're proposing it, and then when Mayor Bloomberg, when the New York City was really very proactive on a lot of these issues, they wanted to remove sugar-sweetened beverages as a 2-year test with SNAP. Not that you couldn't buy it, just couldn't use SNAP benefits and all these kinds of things. We don't know if it's going to be helpful in the United States. How we're going to address it, I think if we could just address the sugar-sweetened beverage consumption, it would be helpful, but how to do it, I absolutely have no idea. I think there are concerns about taxes because it tends to be regressive, and we don't know in this economy with, again, such a small proportion of our disposable income going to food, whether it is going to make a difference or not. What we do know is if you buy a can of soda, diet or sugared, in the vending machine, you can spend up to $2 a can. Whereas if you go to your supermarket on a special, it's $2.50 for a case of 12. So I'm not sure price is a major issue with that. So then it may be starting young. It's not that you shouldn't be drinking sugar-sweetened beverages, but it's teaching kids at an early age. If you drink a sugar-sweetened beverage, this is how much energy you need, this is how many miles you need to run or to walk, to try to put things a little bit in perspectives. And there's some great short clips on the New York City website about that, to try to put it more into context, because I think sometimes people may not realize how much that actually contributes as a percent of what they need. Do you have any ideas?
Don't put that one back on.
Okay.
I'll let you know.
All right, we have several questions that I think how far we can get. Let's start over here.
Just to piggyback on that, nobody ever brings up corn subsidies. We're subsidizing people to make corn and goes into sugar, corn oils, a lot of the things that you mentioned that are cheaper. So rather than taxing it, so now not only are you paying to make it cheap, but now you're getting taxed to make it more expensive. Why don't we just cut the subsidy, and you automatically make it a harder, more difficult choice rather than taxing it?
Yes, well, I'd say that this has to do with subsidies, and I'd say that that has come up. There is a lot of discussion on it. That's a legislative issue, and unfortunately, because a lot of the states benefit from those subsidies, a lot of the decisions that are made more on the basis of politics than made on the basis of the health of the nation. So it becomes far more challenging, in addition to which, as you probably know, there was many opportunities for the public to comment to the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee via the website, and then one time orally in person giving us comments, and we got tons of letters from all these small farmers, large farmers, that, you know, if you recommend less sugar, then you're going to put my sugar beet farm out of business and all those kinds of things. But as far as reevaluating subsidies, I think it's an important point that we should keep on the radar. So thank you.
Let's have this one and then Paul.
So you mentioned an earlier piece that you worked on was the Bring Back Home Economics and talking about nutrition education for children. But a lot of these children, they learn their eating behaviors through their parents and family life. And I was wondering, do you think there's any steps to implement nutrition education in the workplace? Because a lot of times the adults do not have the resources or the means to look for this education.
Yes, I agree with you there. And one of the reasons we felt it was so important was to put it back in the schools is because a lot of the children do not have good role models at home for a whole variety of reasons. And sometimes they're even given the wrong message that, well, I work so hard, I just don't have time to make dinner at the end of the day. Well, I work really hard as an academic, and I had little kids and grew up. And, you know, there are ways of doing that. There certainly are programs in the workplace. There are a lot of programs in the workplace. They tend to be more voluntary and with educational programs. The Heart Association has a very extensive one. Sue Roberts at my institution instituted a program, and we actually did some research on it. And then also just changing the offerings in the cafeteria to make the default option a healthier option. And I heard a fascinating talk about Google Food, and Google serves an extraordinary number of people, and they have reconfigured, very similar actually to what's going on downstairs, but they have really thought about this in terms of both the environment and the types of food that are available, promoting healthy eating, and also offering optional courses. And it was interesting that what the person said is, well, yeah, there are some cooking courses there after work, and actually some of the reasons some of the younger people participate is a great way to meet potential dates. But who cares?
Hi, I really enjoyed your talk. It was very thought-provoking.
Thank you.
As to the latter third of your talk, which was to a large degree focused on what I would interpret as being culture change, I agree 100% that what we really need to be talking about is how to change culture. The big question is how should we do that? And as to the Philadelphia soda tax, that was something that they tried 3 times to do. The first 2 years they tried it and failed. Ultimately because it was going to be a tax just on added sugar, and was really being driven as a healthfulness, a sin tax as it were. And in the third and successful attempt, they transformed it in 2 ways. One was it was no longer a sin tax. They turned it into a revenue generating stream for the city. So it was just about how to make money for the city, which people were more comfortable about than being taxed for their sins. And the second was that the idea that poor people tend to buy a lot of sugary beverage, and therefore the tax would be a regressive tax, allowed them both to tax the diet sodas because it meant taxing the rich as well as the poor, and also on the idea of it being revenue generating, it no longer fell into the category of it being a sin tax. As for its successfulness, they were estimating that it would generate something like $2 to $3 million per month for the city. It's now, I guess, in its 4th month. But for the first 3 months, it's been generating $6 million a month for the city. And as a consequence of this, most major soda distributors in the city, because people are no longer buying them, have stopped distributing 2-liter bottles of soda and 12 packs. So those are sort of gone in the city now.
Wow, thank you for that background. And I think they actually earmarked it for education. The challenge is if the nutrition community is focusing on sugar sweetened beverages, and then that tax includes both, are we diluting the message as far as sugar sweetened beverages? But on the other hand, if it's going to decrease the consumption of sugar sweetened beverages and diet beverages, maybe that's the route. We have to be practical, and I think so that was very helpful.
All right, we have one order of business before we conclude. For this presentation, we have a plaque in recognition of the Hans Fischer Lectureship, Intersection of Nutrition, Science, and Policy, Current Challenges to Alice Lichtenstein, D.Sc., April 20th, 2017.
Wow, thank you.
And also a couple of tokens, a bag from Rutgers, our signature Rutgers Nutritional Sciences cutting board, and and one of our water bottles. Okay. All right, so thank you very much. All right. Thanks everyone for attending, and have a wonderful rest of your day.